Today is the day where I am recording my podcast for the book of Leviticus. If you are new to my podcast, and my podcast is new somewhat, this channel has been used for a variety of things. A lot of the videos have been deleted as my channel is now dedicated to the podcast. Some of my older videos are still there. At one point, I deleted them down to about 200 videos, and then I deleted it down to about just 10, 12 videos, such as the graveside service for my father, things like that I didn't want to lose in the public domain there. So today is the day where I am going to talk with you about the book of Leviticus. Those of you that are familiar with my podcast know that my podcast has a new topic or a new topical podcast every Monday. Additionally to that, for the year of 2025, and this will live longer than that, I am also using the second edition of my book, Deep and Wide, which is a chronological study of the Bible. And I am making a podcast throughout this year, in addition to the Every Monday's podcast, for the 66 books of the Bible. I do know that in the middle there will be a podcast for the Intertestament. And at the end, after Revelation, I will probably do some podcast for some of the essays or chapters that occur before we get into the book. I'm going to talk about some of those today, actually, as we get into that. There are a couple things that I attempt to do in my podcast. One is keep politics out of it. That's not always going to be possible, but that's my goal. The other thing is I don't want to use the podcast just to sell more of my books. Although that would not be a bad thing. I do like to eat and I do like tacos. But for today's podcast, I'm going to be using 5 of my books. Some of them are out of print. You can't even buy them. So I'm not using those books to try and sell more copies of them. Some of them that are not out of print, if they're still in print, and I wrote them and I value the message in there, sure, I'd like the most people as possible to read them. But today, the topic is about Leviticus. And we can't really talk about Leviticus without talking about the Bible itself. I have many Bibles in my house. There are many other versions that I've had in the past that have been lost. Like I used to have one called The Good News for Modern Man that I don't know where that is. Got lost somewhere along the way. I used to have, the very first living Bible I had when in the 70s when I was a kid. I don't know where that one is either. It got lost during a church renovation. At the time, I was teaching a teen Sunday school class in what was the church library. And then when the library got packed up, things went into storage in the transition of building a new building. And then when the books from the church library were retrieved, they had all molded, so they all got thrown away. So since that was where my Sunday school class was, I think that's where my Bible disappeared. I don't know any other way that. But I do have several versions of the Bible that I want to point out to you today as we talk about the English versions of the Bible. I have grabbed the Bibles off of my bookshelf. They normally go right up in there. And there are probably more around the house somewhere. But these are the King James Version of the Bible that I have. One of the misconceptions is this was the very first English version of the Bible, and it was not. There were actually two in English written before this, and several years for Christmas, I got my mother copies of those. If I would have planned ahead a little bit, I would have gone over and grabbed pictures of those. I'll insert a picture here of those two Bibles that I gave. So I have quite a few Bibles here. Some have been my favorites over time. This was the very first little Bible that I was given, King James Bible, and I've written some things in it over the years. And it's old and kind of falling apart and way too small. This Bible was the family Bible that was on the coffee table in our home when I was a kid. So this one is older than this one. It's important to know and understand that the King James Version of the Bible that was written in 1611, and I'll talk more about that later, these examples of the King James Bible, like this one that was on the coffee table of my home in the early 60s, to this one that I was given as a gift when I lived in Scotland, probably around 1969, 1970. These are not the original King James versions of the Bible. Even though you read it, so, oh, that's written in Old English. You know, the King James Version of the Bible is written in 1611. That's not 1611 English in there. For one thing, the letter U looked like a V. There's a lot of things that are different from there. So even the King James Version of the Bible that we say was the original, one, it was not the original. Even the ones that if you go and buy a King James Version of the Bible today, you are not buying a Bible that is as it was in 1611. So anyway, but these are my two oldest versions of the King James Version of the Bible. I have a large pile of New International Versions and some that are based on the New International Versions. I have Bibles in English and in Spanish. Are these my Spanish Bibles? Yes. One of those is based on the New International Version. One is based on the King James. Why it's called the Queen Valera, I'm not sure. If I really cared more about that, I'd research it, but I don't, so I'm not. That's my current version of the Living Bible. It's not the first one I had, but the Message and some other things here. This was my favorite Bible in recent times. This was my favorite Bible in recent times. It's the New Revised Standard Version. And over here is my current favorite, which is the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Okay, so I have a small stack of Bibles over here that are in a different stack. These books claim to be translations of the Bible using Hebrew and Greek without interference from the King James Version. These over here, even the NIV that started out as going back to the Greek and the Hebrew and the Aramaic and looking at ancient texts, in their writings and their studies, they recorded that when they could not agree on an interpretation, they would default to the King James. So there's problems with that. If you look through my collection of New International Versions from the first one that was released in the 70s, and I still have those, my parents bought the full New International Version. It first came out as the just the New Testament that we used around the same time we had the Living Bible. But when the New International Version came out in the 70s, my dad actually pre-ordered 4 leather-bound with their names on them. I remember I wanted a tan one. My dad got a tan one. His got lost somewhere when he pastored a church in Huntsville. When they left there, somehow they didn't get out with the Bible. It was probably left in the pastor's study there. My brother had a black one. I don't know if he still has his original 1970s version or not. My mother's was red. She says she still has hers, but I'm thinking she wore that out, and I think the one that she thinks is that one was the one she got after that. But anyway, she's got it. Covers are all tore off. My mother writes all over her Bibles when she reads them. I actually got her a copy of the NRSV UE, and she's and actually in purple. I got this one in purple because I don't know why, it was really cheap. But then they were working on the updated edition, and then I got this brown one, and they had one in purple, and so I ordered that, and I gave that to my mother, and she's currently reading through that and writing it. She says she really likes it. It's my favorite too. So I've taken all my Bibles off my shelf. Here's my King James Version, and here's the ones that, even though they claim to be translations, and then there's some here that don't claim to be translations, they're paraphrases, but the ones that claim to be translations, even the NRSV that I've liked for many years, even admit that their translations were tarnished by the King James Version. In fact, the updated edition was really all about removing the tarnishments, where when they were in conversations and they were unclear of defaulting to the King James, because that had become the tradition of 400 years. In their updated edition, they went back and said, no, we cannot put out words and say this is a true translation if we could not figure out what something meant, and we defaulted to what they said in 1611. So in this big pile of Bibles, really there's the only one that I think is the most accurate in the year 2025, and that would be the NRSV UE updated edition. Because in creating this Bible in English, when there was something they could not agree on, the committee that was interpreting something, they did not default to the 1611 King James Version. And knowing that what we have sitting here on my chase is not the original King James Version of the Bible, because it had been edited and revised just based on the English language for years. So, in this pile of Bibles, you have to know and understand that Moses nor Jesus spoke English. So everything on here, well, two of these Bibles are in Spanish. One is in Greek and English. One is in Hebrew and English. But on some level, all Bibles in English must be a paraphrase on some level, even though some of them claim to be translations but made some serious mistakes. Some claim to be translations and then realized years later, we made some mistakes in how we did some stuff. So let's correct our procedures. It wasn't about correcting what it said. It was about correcting procedures. And sometimes they corrected their procedures, and what showed up here was exactly the same. Sometimes it was not. It's important to know and understand that Moses and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul, and Jesus' brother James, and Jesus' brother Jude, and then all of the other prophets that wrote portions of what we call the Old Testament, they did not speak English. The New International Version came out, and they actually hired a team of translators to go back and look at the oldest known transcripts of Greek, because at one point all the Old Testament was translated into Greek as well. So that they went back and they did that, and about half of the church was very excited about that. You know, they were looking for a translation that was easier to understand and a translation that'd be more accurate. I remember the older people in the church so mad. That back in that time, people would stand up on Sunday night service and give their testimonies. And I remember this old man that said, well, do not change the Bible. The King James Bible is the only one we should use. If it was good enough for Paul and Silas, it's good enough for us. Well, Paul and Silas didn't speak English. So there was a lot of problems there. And the problem really is about when you challenge people with their traditions and their beliefs and things change, they do not change easily. And so a lot of the things that I can't help but talk about when we're looking at the book of Leviticus challenges beliefs and traditions about what people have always been taught and always believe. And if something you've always been taught and always believe is actually wrong, then you got to fix it. Not bury your head in the sand and pretend, nope, I'm not going to change. This is what I believe. Doesn't matter. And that's that's just not a healthy way to be, especially if it leads you to hurt people and do things that are unchristian while you're pretending, or I shouldn't say pretending, because there are some people that truly do want to be Christ-like and Christian, but their old traditions and old beliefs get in the way and prevent them from carrying out the mission. In fact, some people are so set in these old traditions and old beliefs that they are unwilling and actually unable to hear from God, and they cannot even be changed by God because there is no possible room for God to really speak to them if it differs from what they have already placed upon God that's not from God. Okay, there's my whole sermon. I could be done. So if you've had enough of Leviticus at this point, you can go ahead and turn off right here. Okay, looking at the Bible. And it kind of all does start with the King James Version with us. However, it's important to know and understand the King James Version of the Bible was not the first English version of the Bible. There were two others, and I will insert pictures here because right now I can't remember what they were. And I'd read and studied about them. And in fact, a couple years ago for Christmas, I ordered copies of those for my mother, which she has just loved, annoying the people in her church with it by reading scriptures from these really ancient. No wonder I can be so annoying. I think it's genetic. My father also enjoyed annoying people by challenging their beliefs. So, I want to read, I'm not really reading, but a lot of the things I've done and researched, I've written about. So it's going to make sense today as I go through Leviticus to actually look at my own research that's published. Some of it's out of print, some of it's not. This is not out of print. This is the second edition of my book, Deep and Wide, which is the whole guidelines for this secondary podcast series that's coming out in 2025. And if we're going to talk about the King James Version of the Bible, we have to talk about King James. And I'm telling you right now, a lot of you will not want to hear the truth about King James. And I don't know why that is. A lot of times when you begin to challenge your own beliefs or challenge the beliefs of others or hear other people challenging your beliefs, you close your ears, you close your minds. But a lot of people do not want to hear the truth about King James. In fact, when my first edition of this came out, my mother was very upset that I wrote these things about King James. So she went right to Google and found all these sources and sites that countered all of the things that are here. But if you actually look at the actual historical records, not biblically based, people that have no agenda other than to share the history, these are truths about King James. If we look at what we now know as the United Kingdom, but in history it was called Great Britain. There were multiple kingdoms, all on what, you know, we talk about Britain as England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. Ireland's now split into Ireland and Northern Ireland. There were other little kingdoms and countries in there as well that at different points joined together and made up the areas that there are. Scotland and England were two kingdoms once upon a time. And there were groups that wanted to join them together, but how did they do that back then? You had to go to war and you had to conquer one. And there were periods of times where one got conquered by the other, and then they unconquered themselves, if you want to say. But King James is the one who joined them. And it was only because King James VI of Scotland was also, because of royalty marrying royalty, which they've gotten away from that in some kingdoms that have persisted till today, but they still hold a lot of value in tracing the line and the lineage to prove that there's validity in there. And so, you know, to instill peace, one king's daughter would marry another king's son, and then there was a joining, and so you're not going to go and attack some of your in-laws, you know. And so it was a way of keeping peace as well. Well, how that ended up was King James of Scotland, he was King James the Sixth of Scotland, actually was next in line for the throne of England. And so what happened when the monarch of England died, the next one in line was James, who was already King of Scotland. He was King James the Sixth of Scotland, but he was the first King James of England. So he was known as King James the Sixth and King James the First, because he was King James the Sixth of Scotland, but King James the First of England. Now, a little bit of history. What you need to know going back in those times, at one point, there was a break from Catholicism, a break from the Holy Roman Empire. There was a break from the Pope. Before it was called Pope, I think it was called the Holy Ruler. You know, I should research that, but that's not what this is about. I've read and studied about that. It's probably on one of these great big timelines charts that I have around my office here, that because I'm a real nerdy that way. I get into that. But there was a break, and it impacted the people of England more so than in Scotland, but it impacted the people there. It actually impacted the people of Ireland all the way up into the 1970s, when there was still a war in Ireland that was basically Protestants versus the Catholics. I mean, that was really the war all the way into the 1970s. That was a big thing when I lived in Scotland, about the war and the conflict just right across the short little piece of water there over to Ireland. But the people of England hated the Catholics so much that they put into their government and their rules and their laws that if a queen or a king or their next in line were Catholic, they could not be the reigning monarch. Okay? So there was a movement away from Catholicism. And in order for James VI to be James I of England and rule both, he could not be Catholic, and more so, he had to be very anti-Catholic. So he ordered that the Bible be translated into English. It wasn't the first time it was translated in English. It was the most prolific or the most famous time that it was translated to English, but he ordered that it be translated into English in a way that supported his Anglican beliefs. In other words, he needed the Bible to be as anti-Catholic as it could be. That really was the purpose. And so he hired and charged a group of people who were men. You know, back then, women didn't do anything like that. And charged them with translating the Bible in a way that would support his beliefs. Okay, you do realize that King James was not God. So creating a Bible that aligned with the beliefs of King James, there's really no theological value in that, but we have placed a lot of theological value in this story. Now, study in history this man known as King James. He was not a good person. He also happened to be gay. Now, he was not a bad person because he was gay. He was a gay person who also happened to be a bad man. Okay? There are some bad people that are heterosexual. There are some good people that are heterosexual. There are some bad people that are gay. There are some good people that are gay. Okay? The variable of being gay or not gay does not make someone good, nor does it make someone bad, nor does it make someone Christian or non-Christian. Sexual orientation is not a variable that determines Christianity. Not in human eyes and not in God's eyes. Okay, so get that straight. I mean, that's important. It doesn't take much history to know and understand that there was a man named King James who authorized the translating of the Bible into a version of English that was supportive of his Anglican beliefs, which really was a political move for him because he needed to support a Bible that was anti-Catholic. So they needed to make sure they squashed and downplayed any parts that were thought to exist in the Bible that would be supportive of Catholic ideas that were in contradiction to those of Protestant ideas. Are you getting the picture here? It is important anytime you study the Bible, especially when we get into issues of this version against this version or this translation against this translation. You have to go back to the version that we claim is the foundation for the English Bibles. I did that on my ottoman over here with the collection of Bibles in my house. We went through that. Most, not quite all, but almost all of the English versions of the Bible have been impacted, influenced by this 17th century English version of the Bible. Okay. That is fact. If you can't accept that fact, there really is no point in listening to the rest of this podcast. So, in my book, The Christian Response to LGBTQ, and let's be honest here. Let's look at the elephant in the room. If we're talking about Leviticus today, we're going to talk about gay people. So in my book, The Christian Response to LGBTQ, on page 33 and 34, I actually talk about using the Bible. Okay? The Bible has been misused. That doesn't mean that you can't use the Bible because it's misused. I have a computer here. There are people that misuse the computer in order to steal money from people. So because some people misuse the computer does not mean that I'm going to say all computers are bad, you should never use them. I mean, that's illogical. So people do misuse the Bible, and they use the Bible to hurt people. That doesn't mean that we're going to throw the whole Bible out because some people use it wrong. However, I did make a little chart at the end of my little essay on using the Bible that ends on page 34 of my book, The Christian Response to LGBTQ. This book is not out of print. Long after I'm dead, if this is my best-selling book, I'll be happy with it. Okay, so this is talking about using the Bible. And so I have a section here on the Bible for the 21st century church. That's us today, people. Okay? King James Version of the Bible, which is a lot of our conversation today on Leviticus, is going to be from 17th century writings. Okay? All right. The Bible for the 21st century. Christian Living and Theology. And I list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books of the Bible. Okay, if you're looking at a Protestant Bible, there are 66 books of the Bible. 66. And my premise is you can only use 7 of those for Christian living and theology in the 21st century. All of those are in the New Testament. I don't include anything from the Old Testament that's going to tell me how I should live or guide my theology. And here are the ones that I think that are still valid today for Christian living and theology. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. The book of James, which is written by James, the half-brother of Jesus. And the book of 1 John, the author of the Gospel of John. There are 3 books in the Bible, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. He's also attributed by writing the book of Revelations. Out of all of those others, the only one that I think that's really significant for Christian living and theology would be 1 John. I think in one of my other podcasts, I kind of had a similar conversation, and I mistakenly said Acts, James, and 3 John. No, it's not 3 John, it's 1 John. There are some other books of the New Testament that are helpful, like everything else in the New Testament. But we have to be very careful about using those for theology, because while they are inspired by God's voice, they truly are human voices. Now, there are many times where within human voices we may also hear God's voice, but we have to be careful with all of the writings that are attributed to Paul, and not all the writings that are attributed to Paul are authentically by Paul himself. And then all of the Old Testament are only important because they help us know how and why the people continued to fail, and what they believed, and why Jesus was needed. Let me tell you, because that's important today, because we're going to be talking about Leviticus. The Old Testament books, they are useful for understanding how and why the people continued to fail, what they believed, and why Jesus was needed. Okay? So when we're looking at the book of Leviticus or anything in the Old Testament, we need to read it so for the purpose of understanding how and why the people of that time continued to fail, to help us know and understand what they believed, and help us know and understand why Jesus was needed. In my last podcast on Exodus, I talked a little bit about the laws of Moses, the rules of Moses, even the Ten Commandments. And when we addressed that last point that I talked about, knowing and understanding why Jesus was needed, that was my third point there. I can make a sermon on that. That was my third point. Really led to the development of my book on the Beatitudes. It's called A Deeper Calling. This book is not in print. It's too long to be an essay and really too short to be a book, but it's a very, very small book on the Beatitudes. It would make a nice little mini devotional study, but it really isn't written that way. But anyway, this book came about really from having a disagreement with one of my cousins. Several years ago, maybe many years ago, there was a Facebook war going on about posting the Ten Commandments in places. And actually that got renewed a couple, I think in the state, was it Louisiana last year? Even that battle came back up that we're going to post the Ten Commandments in every classroom. People are getting all upset and everything about, we got to put the Ten Commandments in every classroom. And I'm thinking like, why? Why do we want to post the Ten Commandments in every classroom? If we totally ignore the argument that that's antithetical to the founding of our country, but if we really do want to force our religion on everyone else, then why wouldn't we post something that actually matters? Like the Beatitudes, or in this book, I called it A Deeper Calling, Beatitudes, Attitudes of Being. And actually, why not post the Beatitudes? Because that's what Jesus calls us to. So if we really are claiming to be followers of Jesus, not just followers of ancient rules and religion from 4,000 to 7,000 years ago, but if we really want to focus on what we say we really are, followers of Christ, why would we not elevate the words? And so we talked about the Beatitudes and what Jesus calls us to do instead of the Ten Commandments. You know, it's kind of like, do you really need to post on your wall, thou shalt not kill, so that we know we're not supposed to kill people? You know, so to me, the Ten Commandments are like duh. And maybe for the people at the time, they really needed some structure at the very foundation so they could be taught. A lot of the other rules of Moses was about so the people could be controlled. And because of this great movement to control the people, the religious leaders rose up to control people and condemn people and point out all the wrongs people were doing, which that's why Jesus was needed, because they were way down the wrong path. Their religious organization, which we would call church today, were way off of what they were supposed to be. And so in this book, this comes from really Matthew 5, and this is where Jesus had his Sermon on the Mountain. And when you get after the Beatitudes, real good thing about being the salt. We are called to be the salt. We are called to be the light. Light does not occupy space and has no mass. So light is not matter. We say everything in earth, I'm getting sciencey here. We say everything that exists is matter because it occupies space and has mass. Light doesn't have mass, and it doesn't technically take up space. A light allows us to see as it filtrates in to space. But light by itself, I almost want to say light by itself is not really a thing. It's a concept. We benefit from light, but light just is. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't occupy space. It illuminates space. So when Jesus calls us to be light, light just is. So we are called to just be. We're not called to take some version of the Bible and go whack people upside the head with it. That's not what our calling is. So anyway, I don't really want to have a conversation about Leviticus. If I want to have a religious conversation, I want to have a conversation about the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount and the things Jesus calls us to do. So, that book's not in print, but I wanted to talk about that. If you're looking at the Old Testament rules and the rules that the people had at the time Jesus came, Jesus was needed because of these rules. There were 613 rules that the people had to follow. 613 rules the people had to follow. The people totally missed the point. That's why Jesus had to come. Okay. In Leviticus, if we're talking about Leviticus, there's really, if you just mention Leviticus, pretty much all anyone wants to say or knows and understands about Leviticus is one scripture that says, if a man lies with a man as if he was a woman, he is an abomination and should be put to death. Okay? King James Version. The word abomination is a 17th century vocabulary word. Abomination is not a separate worse category of sin. It just is not. In fact, when you look at the New International Version, the word abomination is not used in that verse. Because modern English versions are supposed to use language of the English language that's current. The word abomination is not a current word. So when people look at Leviticus and they talk about Leviticus, the only thing people talk about is that one verse, King James Version, because the word abomination is not in the best modern English version. If a man lies with another man as if he were a woman, then he is an abomination and should be put to death. It says that there. In the book of Leviticus, using 17th century language. Now, if you get into the modern versions, they will say basically the same thing, except they don't use the word abomination because that's not an English word that we use today. But if you ask people about an abomination, they want to talk about gay people. Period. That's it. If you want to talk about Leviticus, they want to talk about gay people. Period. That's it. That's not what the book of Leviticus is about. The book of Leviticus gets into more of the rules for the people. And specifically, Leviticus was the rules for the Levites, which would be their religious leaders. One of the rules for the Levites was that they were to have but one wife. The people at that time in culture had multiple wives. Look at all of the patriarchs. Abraham had 4 wives. I don't know how many wives Joseph had. They only talk about the one who, and it didn't seem like he really was all into her, had 2 kids. Maybe he wasn't into women, I don't know. Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, yes, people have changed their names, and we can use their new name. So Jacob became Israel. He had 4 wives. King David had 7 wives. His very first wife was actually King Saul's daughter, who was the sister of Jonathan. You all know the story of David and Jonathan. I'm not going to go there today. But his first wife was actually Jonathan's sister. I think her name was Michael, or Michelle, or however you want to say that. But she was mad because he wouldn't lie with her. He never did lie with her, according to the stories we find in the scripture. He wasn't interested in her. She made fun of him in public. She was mad at him, because when he would dance in the street, it wasn't very manly, and so she was upset with him. But anyway, and then Solomon had thousands of wives and concubines. Yeah, we're not going to get into having concubines, but apparently that's okay to have mistresses if we're looking at biblical guidelines for how to live today. Have many wives, have many mistresses, babies all over the place. That's okay. That's okay. Okay, so I wrote a book, Abominations. This book is not in print. You can't buy this book. It's no longer in print. It's research, and so just reading this book, unless you like reading research, this would be very boring for you. I'm very proud of this book because this took a long time. This book, I'm just going to read off of the back cover because it's a summary of the book. The word abomination is simply an English vocabulary word that was commonly used in the 1600s when the earliest English versions of the Bible were written. Today, 400 years later, many Christians believe that an abomination is a worse category of sin, and most believe it's about homosexuality. This is false. In this study, 143 verses in the King James Version of the Bible were found that used the word abomination or forms of the word. The word abomination was used twice in the Living Bible. It was used 15 times in the Message and 9 times in the New International Version. At the time, I was not using the Revised Standard Version, and the Revised Standard Version Updated Edition wasn't even published at that point. Okay. It's interesting that the word abomination in the Old King James Version of the Bible was used 143 times. But if you ask the average person on the street about the word abomination, they're saying, oh, that's about them gay people. Not true. Not true. It is a 17th century English word. So if you're going to study abominations, you're really doing a 17th century word study. Do you know there's a scripture in the Bible, and I got the King James Bible out, that says the Israelites were an abomination to the Egyptians? The Egyptians thought the Israelite people were horrible, weird, strange, something wrong with those folks. One of the reasons the Egyptians said the Israelites, the Hebrew people, were abominations, because they killed animals in the religious ceremonies to atone for their sins. I think that's pretty gross. I wouldn't go to church if I went to church and I had to bring a little cute little baby goat or a baby sheep and bring it to the church, and they're going to slit its neck, and the altar of the church had all the blood stains from everybody else's sin offerings. That does sound pretty abominable. Okay. There are 143 times in the King James Version that the Bible where the word abomination was used. So why do we look at Leviticus and say, oh, it's about the gay abomination? That just simply is not true. That's not what Leviticus is about. There's a lot of things in Leviticus. Okay, for one, it is an abomination for a man to trim the sides of his hair or the sides of his beard. It was a wrong. They were not supposed to do that. So if you went to church this past Sunday and there were men in the church that had the hair on the side of their heads trimmed so that you could see their ears, and they had the hair on the sides of their face trimmed back, they are in violation of the Bible's rules found in Leviticus. So if your hair is short on the front, long in the back, in the 80s they called that part business on the front, party in the back. And they called it the mullet. Personally, I think that was a bad hairstyle. I don't need to use Leviticus to tell me that was a bad hairstyle. I think that was a bad hairstyle. But I don't remember seeing anyone quoting that verse in Leviticus, putting on a big poster that says, God hates mullets, and walking into all these places where people had their hair short on the sides and front and long in the back and saying, you're a sinner and you're going to hell. God hates mullets. And some people have already checked out of this conversation and said, Larry, you're a nut. Of course no one would do that. But people do that very thing with a different verse in the same book of the Bible, Leviticus. While this book is all research, very boring if you don't like research, it's not in print, so you can't be bored by this book any longer. On the cover, I drew a little cartoon. This man there's like they're picketing and protesting. Here's a snowman, and this person is holding a sign that says abominable snowman. And this person is holding a sign that says abomination. Well, not even using 17th century language of the word abomination, but the misappropriation of that word abomination, abominable, in 21st century, looking at 400-year-old English, we then would have to say that God hates snowmen because they're abominable. They're an abomination. If we want to be consistent in taking this word abomination, which just something that you don't like or creeped you out, like, I think that sushi is ooey. I have no interest in eating sushi. So for me, if I want to use this word appropriately, sushi is abominable. Sushi to me is an abomination. It weirds me out. I think it's gross. I don't want anything to do with sushi. Period. That's using the word abomination correctly. Here's the big problem I have with the word abomination and the misappropriation of it and the misappropriation of Leviticus. Every once in a while on Facebook, I'll encounter someone who is having a battle. Sometimes they're having the battle with themselves. I don't know. Where people are in uproar against the gays. And they actually quote this verse in Leviticus. If a man lies with a man as with a woman, he is an abomination, and they shall be put to death. And the murder or the sin of committing murder. You know, thou shalt not kill is actually in a commandment. But the sin shall be placed on their heads, not the person actually doing the murdering. Which is one of the things Jesus taught was, hey, you have heard, but I tell you. So he would quote their law or their rule and says, you have heard, this is the rule. You know this, people. But I tell you. So he's saying, you've heard this. So you're following this law, and you have all these loopholes. But I'm telling you, using these loopholes is not getting around doing the right thing. So he's telling all these people about this. And then people don't even look at that. They're looking at this one scripture. Okay, thou shalt not murder, but it's okay to murder someone if there's a man who's lying with another man as if it was a woman, then it's okay to murder them. You know, without being gross, it's like, how do you know this man is lying with another man and he's doing it in a way that it's as if he was a woman? Are you peeping in the windows? And if two men are being sexual together, then they're probably gay, which means they have no interest, arousal, or ability to be with a woman. So why would he pretend the man was a woman? He wouldn't. So my joke and my truth is, if a man is lying with a man as if he was a woman, then he's doing it wrong. That's not what being gay is about. Okay? More on the word abomination. The research book was boring. I made a cartoon, which just focuses in just on the point that I'm making today. It's a very simple cartoon picture book. It's not really a genre. It's kind of like something I created. It's not really a picture book. It's not really a cartoon, but these three guys here on the cover have a conversation. This is still in print. It is in color, so the cost to print this is substantially more. And it's a very simple book, but anyway. Said I wasn't hawking books, but that one actually is on. Yeah, I should have insisted that one be made as a hardback because of the type of book it is. Too late, didn't do that. Okay, so there are people that still come out and they'll quote Leviticus, and it's this one verse about if a man lies with a man as if he was a woman, then they shall be put to death, and their murder or the sin of murdering them shall be placed on their heads, not the person actually murdering them. There are people that quote that scripture, say it's in the Bible said, and my biggest problem with that is a lot of the people making the most noise about that don't read the Bible. And they would be surprised if they open the Bible in their house, which is less likely they may not even have one, but it's less likely they would open up a King James Version. They would have probably the NIV or the New Revised Standard Version, and they're going to go to that scripture and they're going to read it, and they're going to say, wait, the word abomination's not there. Where'd it go? because they're not reading a Bible that was written in 1611, or they're not reading a Bible that where the authors or translators defaulted to 17th century English because they wanted to make a point that was not originally made. So let's wrap this up here. So the inconsistency and the hypocrisy that comes out of the book of Leviticus, not out of the book of Leviticus, but out of the way people use the book of Leviticus, that's where the story really is. So, while I used to say, I don't want anyone to read the book of Leviticus, it's dumb, it's stupid, it has nothing to do with us today, I want to say that in a different way. I want everyone to read the book of Leviticus, but only if they're going to read it, thinking about, knowing and understanding how the people lived and believed and why Jesus was needed. And if you read the book of Leviticus, I want you to get out some paper and pencil, and I want you to make a list. I want you to make a list of all the things you find in Leviticus that are rules for the people that you don't believe is meant for us today. And you will find lots of things. There is no one on planet Earth, Christian or other, that would open up their Bible and read the book of Leviticus and write down all the rules and regulations and say, yes, I need to do that, or yes, I need to not do that. Yes, this rule is for me. No one would read the book of Leviticus and say, yes, these rules are for me. No one. So my challenge is no longer, nobody read Leviticus, it's stupid, to everybody read Leviticus and make a list of the rules and regulations in there that you think don't have anything to do with you living today. Nobody would have an empty list. And that's the point. The people that Leviticus was written for, whether you believe it was written just for the priest, like they could only have one wife, where everybody else could have many wives and mistresses as they wanted. Were these rules just for the priests? Were these rules for everybody? Were these the rules for the people 4,000, 6,000 years ago? Are these rules for the people in the 21st century? I'll answer that for you. No, they are not. These rules were written and recorded by Moses because they needed to control their people. Because they need to make sure the people were good and worthy of God's love, which is not the way it works. People are worthy of God's love. You don't have to prove yourself worthy. Do you need to be good people? Yes. Is it wrong to be bad people? Yes. So, to me, it's not that difficult to understand that the rules in Leviticus were the rules that the people had based on their beliefs, based on what they felt they needed, and actually builds the foundation for why Jesus was needed, because the people got it wrong. They were focused on rules and not focused on loving their neighbors. It really is that simple. It really is this simple. It's not hard. It's not hard. The Bible is the tool to help us love others and care for others and be Jesus to others. The Bible is not a tool to condemn others and push them out or give us loopholes to murder people we don't like for whatever reason. The beliefs that the people had at that time had a lot of misconceptions. The world is not flat. The sun is not a smaller object in our sky. All of life is not contained in the male ejaculate. The baby's not in semen. That's what they thought back then. So if the male ejaculate went anywhere other than inside a vaginal cavity, then you were murdering a baby. Women were thought to be irrelevant in conception. They were where the man planted his seed, like planting seeds in the dirt. They considered women property with the rights and equivalency of the dirt where you planted your seed. It really is that simple. So, a lot of the misconceptions people had at that time impacted their rules and their beliefs. Period. Leviticus. I think everyone should read it, but only if they're willing to make a list of all of the rules that they read that have nothing to do with living in the 21st century. For whatever reason, whether they're grounded in misconceptions or what. Be focused on the teachings of Jesus. Be focused on the teachings of Jesus, specifically Matthew chapter 5. Use the Old Testament to help you know and understand the people at that time, what they knew and understood, and why Jesus was needed. If you like this content, or maybe you don't like this content, but if you want to hear more from it, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching. And I apologize for this one being so long, but I didn't know any other way to do it.